Hi guys, Emily Patillo and Sarah Franzen from RevZen. We are here today with another mini podcast, and I actually wanted to unpack a little bit on Sarah's recent LinkedIn post because I think she made a really, really great post that most of us do experience. So I'm going to give the stage to Sarah so we can chat about that a little bit more. We'll try to keep this one a little bit shorter than some of our previous ones, but Sarah, tell me what your post is about.
We always say we're gonna try to keep these short, and then we never
I
do,
know
but
they never happen, but maybe this will happen this time.
the post that you are referencing is one that came from just experience that I've had, and I'm sure that every revenue manager, every property manager has probably had. They've got this listing that is just the golden child listing, right? And it's got everything going right for it, but for whatever reason, it's not booking, and nobody can figure it out. The rates are right, the restrictions are right, and it's not booking. Or on the other hand, you've got this, turd of a home, lack of a better term. You know that the photos are terrible. The listing isn't great. It doesn't have a good history of booking. Maybe the reviews are bad. All sorts of things, and then it gets a booking, and not just a booking, but like a pretty good booking. And you're
Oh,
like,
yeah.
what in the world? And so, I mean, usually, because we work with great clients, we have the first thing, the former. But the latter has happened. And I'm like, well, I don't understand why this one books and, this one doesn't. And so, that was kind of the idea of presenting this post and then saying, like, okay, the reality though is that, every night has a certain odds of booking, right? A certain percentage odds of booking. And we never know exactly what those odds are. We never know what that percentage is based on demand because we never have all of the inputs really at our disposal. But that's just the way it is. And sometimes, a really great property won't book. And other times a really yucky property does. And it just means that the yucky property just beat the odds of that night. And then kind of what I kind of tied it all into with the post was, the bottom line is you have to be ready. You have to make sure you have got those I's dotted and T's crossed. The listing is good. The photos are good. Your rates and restrictions are dialed in. Your policies are where, they need to be. You're taking advantage of, all of the merchandising, all of that, so that, when you're playing the odds, you have the best chance of beating the odds. Because at the end of the day, there are just odds, right? And you're
Right.
not gonna hit them all. So that was kind of the idea of the post, and it's comes from a lot of experience, a lot of frustration,
Right.
but I think, a good reminder for us that, if we set ourselves up to beat the odds by being prepared and by taking advantage of the opportunities when they come along, which was the reference to Seneca that I mentioned there, that's how we set ourselves up to perform the best. That was really
Right.
sorry.
No, I think it's great because we've all kind of experienced this. If you've been in the industry long enough, you've been doing this, we consistently second guess ourselves because the data is not always clean. So you kind of have to, although there's not a formal structure for this, and if anybody figures out a formal structure for this, I think they would need a crystal ball, but also they would probably be, instantly rich because this is really the $1 million question is what is the percentage likelihood of a property being booked and how do I get it to 100%, but also an optimal rate, right? So that is something that we've experienced quite a bit. You have a property that eh, it's not booking and you lower the rates. Does that change your percentage? You have a property that an owner gives you a minimum rate. And this happens to, I think anybody that's been doing this long enough has had an owner that's established a minimum rate either for the entire year, for specific date ranges. And you're like, oh my gosh, that's never going to book. If I had to assign a value in my head, that might be like a 5% chance of it getting booked. And then what do you know? There's a couple dates that actually book at those prices. And then you have to go and have that conversation with the owner because they think that it's going to continue, right? But what you were talking about in your post was, yeah, you're going to have those things sometimes, right? You're going to have those bookings because some of it is just pure luck. There might just be that only property that's available or somebody that really emotionally latches on to that property for whatever reason. It could have had something in the back of the photo and they're like, I really like that. I want this property for this particular day with no other logic tied into it. And then that's kind of this, I forget the psychological term for it, but it's like you're creating your own destiny there by saying, or self fulfilling prophecy, to an extent where the owners are like, we're going to get this rate. And then they do get this rate and they think, okay, I'm going to get this rate all the time. But really, you only had like a 5% chance of booking that. It's not repeatable, right? So I think that we've experienced that kind of on both ends, right?
Yeah, and I think it's just as mind-boggling when it happens on the other end, right? You've got everything going for this amazing, gorgeous property. It's priced very competitively, and you're like, "Why isn't it moving?" And I think what you just said is really important because we price and we restrict and we implement policy to be optimal. Not to be perfect, but to be optimal,
Right.
and sometimes it works. A lot of times it works.
Because we're
But
working with
sometimes it doesn't.
data, not a crystal ball.
That's right. That's right. I'm just going to say this. I'm going to go off on a little tangent here, but it just reminded me of this. I'm in the process of selling my parents' childhood home. They didn't touch the home for 50 years. Like the home was built in like 1955. 90% of the home hasn't changed since 1955. And so because of that, the home is going to list for a pretty low number, right? But I was talking to a friend of mine and she was like, "Oh my God, that's my dream home." She loves the vintage. She loves the terrible linoleum that I've been looking at for 51 years. I think is just hideous. And she saw that linoleum and she was like, "That is my dream home. I love the linoleum. I love the wall sconces in the bathroom." I'm like, "Oh my God."
Right.
But that's just kind of this illustration of what happens, to your point, when somebody sees a listing and they see something in the background and like, "Oh my gosh, my grandma used to have that vase and I just need to stay in this home because it's nostalgic."
Right.
And that happens. But how often does that happen? You know,
Exactly.
and that's the point that you're saying, like the owner just thinks, "Oh, see, my minimum was perfect. That's exactly the rate that we should have." And that's a really tough conversation, but the conversation happens a lot. And I think it comes back to this, which is the saying, even a broken clock is right twice a day.
Right. Right.
That's that's just kind of what happens sometimes.
Well, and there's probably an element of risk management that goes into this as well. So, if you already have a decent amount of bookings on your calendar, and then you want to play around with those 5 to 10% chances of getting booked type of pricing, you have the flexibility to do that for a certain period of time, right? And then you can always modify it down. So if you want to try to play around with how much you can possibly get, this is kind of getting a little bit deeper, but there's the potential of changing those odds based off of booking velocity and review count and all of that that you might not have had in the beginning. So when you're trying to push that, push the limits, there's the risk management that comes into it. Whereas if you have an owner that's like, they have nothing on their calendar and they're wanting these super, super, super high rates. Okay, maybe you're not in the booking window. You appease them to an extent if they're not listening to the data and maybe they know something that you don't know. Maybe there's something happening on the ground. Or maybe at the end of the day, they just have the final say. And so you plead your case and this is what you have to do. But if they have a calendar that's open and they kind of get into the booking window, then it's risk management. Then it's, having that conversation on a stronger scale and saying, okay, you're not booking at this rate. We have to lower these rates if you want to see that. And then you can kind of put the onus on them where it's like, well, we had the conversation. You've accepted the risk for this moving forward. And so we can play your strategy if you really want to do this, but this is the risk that you're accepting. So at the end of the season, if the performance isn't where it needs to be, or you had to do a fire sale at the last minute just to get those bookings, then it's a lot easier of a conversation to have because you had that kind of documentation along the way.
Yeah, and I think that that's actually really important because I did, within the last couple months, actually have this conversation with an owner about that very thing. And actually explaining this idea of odds to them, it hit, like it really landed. And they were like, "Oh, okay." And so I was like, "If this is what you want to do, just understand that this is always an odds. We can keep the rate up and you might get a booking. You
Right.
absolutely might. There's the odds are never zero, right? So you could just understand that this is how we're looking at a bunch of comps. We're looking at the market. We're looking at all of these trends. We're looking at this data, and I can tell you from the data that we have, which to your earlier point is sometimes it's not always perfect, right? We know that the data in our space is wonderful, but it's not always perfect. So we're looking at that and we're trying to give you the best chance, right? So when I explained this to the owner, they were like, okay, I get it. So if I'm setting my rate higher further out, I might get it, but the odds are lower. If I give you a little bit more flexibility, maybe if I say you can start lowering at a certain point, then I have better chance. As I'm like, yes, if as you get into the window, if we want to hold it strong for a while, but then as we kind of inch into that prime window, into that early window, we start walking it down to try to, yeah, that's a great idea. And he was like, okay, well, I understand that. Whereas I think a lot of times when we talk to owners, we're like, well, you're just not going to book at that rate. And then when they do, they have this kind of validation, like, see, I was right.
Right.
And so I think if we can get away from like, you're not going to book at this rate, but we can say, hey, you might, but the odds are a lot lower. And if we start making these changes earlier, if you give us the flexibility to move earlier, like your odds just increase. We're playing an odds game here. And that I think is a great conversation to have with owners that, at least in this one experience, worked. It landed. And he was like, okay, I get it.
Right. And they can be analytical and understand these things. I mean, obviously, they have this emotional metric that we don't have. We try to be very objective by design of what we do. Conversations could go both ways. But I found that if you break it down with owners, they usually understand your thought process because there is a method behind our madness, even if they can't see it on a day to day basis.
Yeah.
So, like when you were talking about the odds of booking, it's like, okay, well, yes, the odds are low, but your leverage is high, right? Because you're further out. But as you get into the booking window and you're, maybe past the average booking window, then you're starting to lose leverage. And so then you have to decide, okay, do I have enough to make me comfortable as is, or do I really, really need to get some more revenue on the books because I can't be playing this, game of chicken with you, like with the market, essentially, not with us, like with the market to see what's going to happen. Because at the end of the day, like, what is your risk tolerance? Like, what is your nut that you have to make for this particular month to pay your bills, to be happy, to do all of those things? Some owners, they're not in that position. They're like, whatever, see what we can get. And to be fair, sometimes when we are given full leniency with the property, we might be more risk on because as revenue managers, I don't know if you've had that situation where you've had a couple owners or maybe a property manager that's owned a property and they're like, just do what you do. And then you can kind of get really cute with it because they understand the risk and it's kind of like that risk management that goes
Yeah.
into it.
No, and I think that that's a really good point. I mean, yes, I have had those and they're fantastic because if you ever want to like test things, that's the perfect home to test things on. Can become a case study and, all sorts of things for your wider strategy. I mean, those are always like your
Right.
unicorn fantasy kind of homes. But I mean, the truth is like people who can kind of understand the idea that, just because you put a quality revenue manager on your portfolio or on your home doesn't guarantee you bookings. It guarantees that we're setting you up for the best possible outcome.
Exactly.
It doesn't mean we're going to win all the time. It just means that you're going to be set up appropriately and competitively to try to get your share. And more often than not, you do capture your share. It's just that not every home is going to necessarily capture what that segment in the market gets because we are playing an odds game.
Right.
So yeah, I think it's great when we have that flexibility, it's always fun for us, but it's also a really interesting learning experiment for us too, to kind of see what works because something that happens in one market isn't going to happen in another market. It's always an odds game. You're not guaranteed anything. We can just do our
Right.
best and set you up for the best possible results.
That's I perfectly said. So I think that that is the moral of this whole topic is that we are playing an odds game and sometimes the odds are in our favor and sometimes when the odds are not in our favor we're still going to win and sometimes when they are in our favor we're not going to win. It's just about making sustainable choices portfolio wide that are that's repeatable
Yeah.
in many circumstances. So, okay, well, hopefully there's some use in that. And again, we'll probably spin off on some other topics later regarding this because we can go down many different rabbit holes. But thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.